Character Options is an independent toy company based in the United Kingdom, founded in 1991. It has been responsible for designing, manufacturing a large range of toys and games to the public. Some of the most popular brands put out by Character have included Goo-Jitsu, Stretch Armstrong, Peppa Pig, Fireman Sam, Scooby-Doo, and the reason you are all here, of course, is Doctor Who. The licence for the range was obtained in 2005 and has continued into 2025 with no signs of slowing down. Let's go back to the beginning and discuss how it all started to take shape, looking at the world of Doctor Who in figure form. Not to mention the other items that have appeared along the way, including sonic screwdrivers, voice changer helmets, remote control Daleks, and many more. So sit back, set the coordinates to rewind the clock, relax and join us as we discuss character options over the last 20 years and take a peek behind the curtains of those early days and follow its journey until today with our special guests. So let's go. Hello and welcome to Who Cave Conversations. In this little series, we're going to go back to the conception of the character range of figures and other items produced for the range, such as the voice changer helmets, sonic screwdrivers, and a lot of other merchandise linked with Doctor Who and character options. So when we look back at that, we're going to look at any limitations and challenges. So I thought also, while we look at the experience that this has given us over the last 20 years, why not speak to a couple of guys that played a pretty big part in it, who are sitting right below us there. So firstly, let's welcome my friend and co-host Shane. And
hello.
Also a couple of special guests who are right below us there, the dynamic duo, Al Dewar and Ed Barnett-Ward. How are you, gents?
We're good. Well, I'm good. I'm good.
Thank you so much for being part of this little revisit down memory lane to the commencement of character options back in 2005. So, but I thought before we kick into it, gents, we're going to do around the room, a quick chat and have a look. Do you recall your first piece of merchandise? What got you hooked into Doctor Who, or what was your involvement with Doctor Who? That first piece of merchandise you may have ever collected, do you still have it? And fill us in. So maybe, Shane, would you like to let us know?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. Well, I started like I think a lot of Australians did in the 70s, but I'll show my age now, but in the 70s, we had a lot of repeats of the Pertwee and Baker years. Monday to Thursday, ABC TV, on perpetual repeat, half an hour after the goodies every week, year upon year. So I'm not entirely sure when I first was exposed to Doctor Who, but certainly by the time I was 9, which was the start of Leisure Hive, 1980, that was when I stood up and said, oh, hang on, what's this? Paid attention. And I think I've seen everything aired from that moment onwards. Again, mixed up memories. I remember Hand of Fear. I remember The Green Death. But they could have been on repeat in the 80s or in the 70s on the multiple times, but definitely from then. Now, as far as the first piece of collected merchandise, I started getting the Target books around the same time because unfortunately there weren't any really good action figures by then. Target books, the first one I got was Creature from the Pit and started reading that. So again, publication date of that was around 1980 or 79, I think. So, yeah, around the 9-year-old age group was when I got hooked. And yes, I do still have it. And now I've got it in hardback. So I've got a little hardback collection down there. So that's in there now. That's my story.
Very good. I might share from a fellow Australian opinion, like you, Shane, growing up, in the early 80s. I think my first memory of watching Doctor Who was on Mum and Dad's old black and white Astor television that was sitting in a spare room. I think I was the only child till about 5, till my little brother came along to get in the way of the TV set when I was trying to watch Doctor Who. But yeah, I have some vivid memories of mixture of Pertwee Baker, because as you said, there was endless repeats on the ABC here. And so that was probably my first memory. And then I think one I discussed with you, Shane, the other day was looking at basically I remember the Five Doctors when it was co-funded by the ABC here, and I have vague recollections because Mum and Dad wanted to watch a series here called A Country Practice, which was very popular in Australia. Based around a hospital in a fictional town of Wandon Valley, and here am I in between the ad breaks, flicking back to the ABC, just in time to see the Raston Warrior robot take out some Cybermen. So, so that's probably my first sort of look, and then obviously that stemmed into the first piece of merchandise that I have, which I happen to have here right with me. So these couple of guys here. So the technical manual I read over and over as a kid. Couldn't get Doctor Who figures back then. Well, I didn't have access to them. So what I did was I looked at the scale of what was in here and paper and cardboard, and I made my own TARDIS. I made my own John Pertwee, my own, because I watched the Three Doctors a lot. And obviously I went back and made they were my action figures at the time. Basically paper dolls, essentially, and a slit in the side of the TARDIS where I could pop the figures in and off the TARDIS would disappear. The fun things you do as a young child and then the other one piece of merchandise that I had, which this is a remnant of, is the Doctor Who Australian show bag, which was a bit of a rarity. And I had the show bag in its completeness, but unfortunately it went the wayside with most of the other show bags that I'd collected at the time. Some people out there have probably already seen my Who Cave, which it's not the largest collection going around, but it's just a bit of an homage, I suppose you would say, to classic and new series in all shapes and forms, where I'm surrounded by little bits and pieces and reminders of the past. Sitting down, watching television, a couple of cyber heads from Revenge staring down at me, or the Silver Nemesis full-size suit standing there lit up. So it's like a little mini museum, I guess. So I've had a few people come through and have a look and just shocked that, but I just love it. It's just, surrounded by wall to wall Who, and obviously behind me, as you can see, lots of little pieces of plastic representing our favourite little characters from years gone by.
My journey in the early 90s was actually, in the first 2 years of the 90s, was running the local fan club down here in Victoria. I think a couple hundred members, I think, at the time. That's still going strong, that fan club. And that was my early 90s. And then, of course, we had the wilderness years and all that sort of stuff. And we all sort of strayed off a bit and then came back again with McGann. And, here we all are.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. And I said from these, the love of these little figures has obviously stemmed my little love of figure photography, which I've sort of stumbled to later in life, which all stemmed from a request. I posted a couple of photos on Facebook to a group, a Dapol group, and I've put some the Wales Doctor Who exhibition. But yeah, essentially, I just took some photos. And and then that's gone from there. And then I've just sort of now make my own little videos by taking some of the classic scenes and representing them as best as I can with the aid of a little smoke machine and other bits and pieces, trying to recreate some of those effects like they did in the good old days of the BBC, I guess. But yeah, so that's essentially a little bit about me and Shane. Al and Ed, little bit about yourselves, and maybe if you can see what your first bit of merchandise was and how you got into Who.
Go on, Ed. You go first.
Okay, so my connection to Doctor Who stems back to my father, who was a television cameraman, and he filmed from the first series all the way up to 1970 when he left London and the BBC, and one of the last things that he did was the opening titles of John Pertwee's Doctor. He was part of the experimental crew that discovered that if you did fed a camera's output back on itself and pointed it at a monitor, you could create this time tunnel effect that they used in that first sequence. This is going to make a lot of people very upset, but my scrap paper when I was young for doodling on was old scripts, and there is more than a small chance that I was drawing my first stickmen versions of my family on old Doctor Who scripts, because my dad just had piles of them around the house when I was young. First merchandise.
Thanks for that, Ed. That's it for Ed.
Leaves us for dead.
Scribbling on scripts. Oh no!
they had absolutely no value. It's funny enough. There's one or two things that still got very, very few things that I've got some call sheets for Hartnell episodes, and actually, I think I've probably got the Team of the Cybermen call sheets as well. The iconic shot of the Cybermen breaking out of the tomb, that's my dad on #1 camera. He filmed that, so that's my heritage. In terms of merchandise, probably the things that everyone of my age will remember are the Dennis Fisher figures. They're the first sort of real action figures that I ever encountered were Dennis Fisher, and I remember a friend of mine, Kenny McKenzie, had the talking Dalek with a little record player inside it, and I loved that when I used to go around to his house. I never had any of them, but even, Doctor Who was so part of the culture in those early 70s. We on those wonderful days where you used to get things free with breakfast cereal, the Shreddies transfers and the Weetabix games that you could cut out from the back of the packet. Those beautiful illustrations that they did, Tom Baker. Those were the first things. And probably as well, I remember quite even going for a canal boat holiday on the Llangollen Canal with my parents in the 80s, and ending up at the Dapol. They've got a big outlet stroke museum there, sort of at the point where we went as far as we could on the canal before turning around to go back home. I just remember this day seeing all of the Dapol figures there, and thinking, one day I'll do better. They're lovely for what they are, those things.
So on a scale from salvaging scripts and salvaging film rolls to junked episodes and scribbled on scripts, where do you hold yourself? Maybe having defaced scripts, but not as bad as throwing out episodes.
That's very true, but that aspect of things, I talked to Dad about that, but sadly both my parents are passed now. I lost my dad just a couple of years ago, but we certainly did have conversations about lost scripts, and he always had a very pragmatic approach, and he said, look, you've got to appreciate Doctor Who is a beloved series, but nobody wanted to work on it when it first aired, it was a children's program. He was doing they did incredible cutting edge dramas, all of the kitchen sink dramas of the 60s, he did all kinds of classic series. He worked on Shakespeare with Sean Connery and Christopher Plummer, and Sherlock Holmes with Peter Cushing, and millions of other things. And Doctor Who was pretty much just one of the jobs that he did, and so he didn't really pay it much attention. And I used to laugh because probably about 10 or 15 years ago, I wanted to try and get some of his memories down, and sort of and I talked to him at length, tried to get him to write some stuff down, and he did a very what have the Romans ever done for us type response to it, because he was like, I can't remember anything. We didn't, it was just the thing. But I can remember and I can remember and I can remember. So I've got a blog which is mostly concerned with nothing to do with Doctor Who, but I do have one thing that I wrote up his thoughts on Doctor Who in general, which people go find out there if they're interested.
The Peter Cushing Sherlock Holmes could be a fun chat to have another day. I love that
series.
series.
That generated one of his favourite ever anecdotes, which was they had a scene where Holmes and Watson were supposed to be toasting crumpets, and Watson was doing the toasting, and they were using a real fire, and he was completely not paying any attention, just delivering his lines, and the crumpet caught fire, and he was supposed to hand it to Holmes at the end, and he was going to eat it, and Peter Cushing looked at it and went, "Trifle overdone, Watson." There's a bit of improvisation.
Sort of improv.
But moving along, in all honesty, I think you're right. Like your dad was doing stuff at the time that they did. It was just a job back then, and they were doing a show, and so put things in perspective, I guess, is the way I look at it. Things were done at the time, like you said, and we get from beyond. So yes, very good. I think, Al, is it up to you now?
It is, and I have no idea how I follow that. That was amazing. I have one question for Ed, though, which was, which title sequence did he do? Did he do the original sort of coming in
the color, the color? Yeah,
red one.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, classic.
Nice.
So was he involved in when they experimented with flipping it and everything? Was that the Green Death that had that?
Yeah.
Because the thing I remember about the Pertwee titles that they could chop and change a bit like the Baker titles at the end where he's a grey or bright blue, and I always loved the bright blue, but he didn't get it very often.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, I'm supposed to be talking about it.
Just
back to you, Al.
So I don't think I have any. I don't have anything as cool as that in terms of a connection to Doctor Who. I certainly remember. It's interesting actually speaking to or listening to all of you guys, because you triggered a whole bunch of memories, and I literally started making notes down at the side. Mine is just a memory of watching the show more than anything. I mean, I certainly. It's interesting you mentioned about black and white, because I almost certainly must have started watching it on black and white because we didn't have color TV. Certainly I remember watching color stuff on a black and white TV. My earliest memories of it are probably the Pertwee era. I certainly remember those. I remember the Daleks, as everyone does. But then Tom Baker, I think I've used the same anecdote a couple of times, but the Tom Baker regeneration when Pertwee went to Tom Baker. I remember sitting in front of the fire we had an open fire in the house up in Scotland, and I remember sitting there watching Robot, being just completely blown away by the change from one type of actor to the other. And it would have been my first regeneration scene that I would have ever seen. So that even the concept of changing the actor would have been quite weird for me. And again, it's interesting because you guys were obviously saying that you were watching repeats. My memory is that repeats was a really odd thing back when I was watching Doctor Who. You didn't get repeats because essentially
I believe they affected the goodies as well. Yeah. The goodies were really affected by the BBC with that. We got them 4 days a week for years.
Yeah,
on constant repeat.
Even to the
Even to the point where I think you were a little bit later. So my memory is, you didn't get repeats, and if you missed it, you missed it because there was no VCR. So, Sports Scene with Archie McPherson, and then it was Doctor Who.
I had Grandstand.
You had Grandstand. Yeah, Sports Scene.
There were a lot of Australian kids at the time who were brought up on the goodies and Doctor Who.
But it wasn't. It was literally. It was something that was slightly odd time. It was 5:05 on a Saturday, I think, was the exact time, because the Sports Scene was like a really short program where they basically gave you the football results, which I had zero interest in, and then they were straight into Doctor Who. So yeah, that's my early memory.
We 6:30 Doctor Who, 6 o'clock goodies, 6:30 Doctor Who.
Yeah, 6:30 Doctor Who, just before the news and the goodies and Banana Man. Banana Man was also, I think,
Danger Mouse.
Yeah, Danger Mouse, Banana Man, the goodies, and Doctor Who, and there was something else, but I can't recall. But
Danger Mouse is one of those weird programs where I have great memories of that show, but a few years ago when the new one came out, I did a contrast and compare with my kids on TV to show them how good the old one was, and I was mortified because there's no animation in that animation. It's literally a lot of very static shots,
mouth movements and heads.
Yeah.
I remember. Funny, actually, watching the show, I have a similar memory to you, Al, about the transition of moving over to Tom Baker, who was really, really my doctor. Because that idea of repeats, as you say, I think it wasn't probably until the 20-year anniversary they ran a series of repeats in '83 on BBC Two at 6 o'clock. They did a sort of iconic story from every Doctor, and that was the first time I'd ever seen Hartnell or Trout.
The 5 Faces of Doctor Who or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was same. Like literally, repeats just didn't happen. It was interesting about Ed saying about his dad, talking about the way his dad talked about Doctor Who in that slightly dispassionate way. But it was one thing I remember vividly about the program was it was a kids program, but it never talked down to kids. So you went into Doctor Who and it had some quite adult stuff in it. So I guess that's probably why, it was so engaging, because it didn't come across, as being in any way condescending. I watched it because every week the TARDIS went somewhere new. Tons of people died. Nobody died. Everyone, everybody dies.
I mean, that first year,
move on. So it was like, it was great. In terms of, I was trying to, and you guys all triggered my merchandise memories because I could only remember one thing. But obviously we had the chocolate bar, which was the Doctor Who chocolate bar, which I remember vividly. Technical manual I definitely had. I also bought the comic. Well, I say it was my mum, but I bought the comic. And I loved the Dennis Fisher figures, but we could never afford them, so I never had one. But I built a lot of TARDISes, either a plastic card or a cardboard or whatever. In fact, I've still got one. I can show you. This is decades old. Literally.
Probably better than my one-dimensional TARDIS, Al.
I used to build these by the ton, and just
Wow.
You still are.
and just literally.
Yeah, you just build them by the
around
bigger
the
ton.
house. I didn't have any figures, but I used to land them places, and I used to sort of pretend that TARDIS had landed in the garden or in the greenhouse, or the border outside with plants and whatever. Anything that was round was a Centauran ship. So
Have you ever tried your hand at a full scale one?
Pardon me?
Have you ever tried your hand at a full scale TARDIS?
Yes, I did in fact build a TARDIS, a McGann TARDIS, long time ago, probably about 25, 30 years ago. Had a TARDIS which I built, and when I split up from my then girlfriend, the TARDIS had to go. And somebody bought it. So I have memories of a TARDIS being lifted by. I didn't have it long, but I do. But it was good. And I have memories of a TARDIS being lifted out of the garden and put on the back of a lorry to be.
It's a fun project
to its new home. So whether it still exists or not, I don't know. I doubt it.
Transported to another dimension, Al.
I was just having my
kind of
drawer.
put my heart into that TARDIS. So I never really had the sort of feeling to do it again.
I was just having a quick look in my drawers because I know somewhere around here I've got an original Colin Baker comic that came with a packet of shreddies. I usually have it in my desk drawer, but it's probably been shuffled around in the move. So I've recently moved house.
Maybe it's in a box behind you, Ed.
Well, there's a lot in the boxes behind me. Let's face it. But still, I still haven't got my storage sorted out here yet. And I've also got a button I've had since the a badge that I've had since the 1970s. That's got the then logo on it as well.
Very good. Well, gents, I think we might kick off a bit of conversation. Maybe, Ed, about your work history up to present day. Just fill us in a little bit about how you sort of started leading into our conversations for today, and then how you eventually met up with Al and commenced the working partnership that you guys have got today.
So, right, quick. I'll try and be as quick as possible. I tend to go rambling off in all kinds of tangents, but so I started in the toy industry completely by accident. So I did a degree in drama and theatre studies, specialising in film, and I wanted to go into film production when I left. But I was somewhat hampered by the fact that I couldn't drive. So I had issues. I realised I wasn't going to be able to be a runner or any of the menial lower down jobs in the film industry because I just wasn't portable enough. And I needed to utilise other skills. So I thought I'd go into special effects because it was always a toss-up about whether I went to university or whether I went to art school, because I was always painting and sculpting and it really was down to the fact that I wanted to specialise in film. And when I went for my art school interview, they were really sniffy about film, but B, all of my work then was sort of cartoon comic book characters, my own interpretations of them. But they were looking through my portfolio and said, "Haven't you got anything original?" And I was like, "Well, I did all of these things. Just because I didn't create the characters doesn't mean it's not original." But people are sniffy about popular culture, aren't they? So I after university, I tried. I did some very weird, low budget jobs, creating edible snooker balls for a John Virgo video that also had part of the cast of Police Academy in it, and various other weird things that I did. but they were talking about doing new Star Wars, and so I wrote off to Lucasfilm, and amazingly I got an answer back from Nick Dubman, who ran the Creature Workshop, and he said, Ed, I love your passion, you write so beautifully, but you can't, the problem is you didn't go to art school, so you don't have a portfolio, so you can't show me that you can do any of the things that you say you can do. You need to get more commercial sculpting experience. And I had no idea what that meant. I was like, well, commercial sculpting, what does that mean? At the time, I was signing on at the job centre in Finchley. In the days before computers, all the jobs used to be written on little cards. And as I was going through doing trawling to see if there was anything that I would be capable of doing as a sort of interim, coffee bar or whatever, I saw this little card that said wanted sculptors capable of working to a small scale. And I thought, well, that must be commercial sculpting. It's just, they're asking for sculptors. So I took the little card and I phoned the person as you did, and I got an interview, and they explained what they did. And at the time, they were working on a very popular series of toys called Monsters in My Pocket. So I sculpted a caricature of myself as one of the monsters in my pocket, and that was all I had. I sculpted it out of Milliput 2-part epoxy and painted it up, and I took it along to this interview. I found out later I was actually hired as part of a £1 bet. The two people that ran that company, which was Camelot Industrial Artists, the two senior guys, said, one of them said to the other guy called John, said to Russell, the boss, I bet the next person who walks through the door, if they've got any ounce of ability, I'll bet that I can make them do the job. And Russell was like, all right, I'll take that bet. And that's how I was taken on at Camelot. And
trading places.
Yeah,
wow.
Exactly. And also, I think because they somewhat took a shine to my girlfriend, who's now my wife. They asked how I'd got there. It was because it was in a weird little industrial estate in Alperton, near the Hanger Lane Gyratory in London, and I said, "Oh, my girlfriend drove me." And we're like, "What's she doing? Where is she?" She's waiting in the car.
You've got a girlfriend?
They got her in and gave her a cup of tea and talked to her probably as much as they talked to me. But it was all worked out. So Camelot was the first company, and actually that was the first company that I encountered Al at. So the early stages of my career were mostly things like Monsters in My Pocket, but I had a knack of sculpting cute things. So I used to just do sort of little anthropomorphic dragons and Wind in the Willows characters and all sorts of sweet things like that. But there was a sort of circularity to the whole Star Wars thing, because we, in those days in this country, there was probably only 3 companies that did sculpting for prototypes. There was ourselves, Camelot Industrial Artists, there was Synapse, and there was a company called Paul Gillingham, who had a sculpting house as well. It's weird now because those kinds of organizations just literally don't exist. You don't have large studios with 25 sculptors sculpting things by hand anymore. Everything's done digitally.
Ireland probably do.
I don't know. I think the first job we did a lot of at Camelot. We did a lot of work for Hasbro. We did Action Man. We did Cindy. We did game pieces for Hasbro. And I know Al was at Hasbro, and I'm not sure if we did anything directly through Camelot.
You would have done game pieces for us, almost certainly.
Yeah,
because I was in the games department, although sort of latterly I sort of was getting involved with other areas as well. So
I think the first thing I remember was a Jar Jar Binks slide puzzle. was the 3D slide puzzle. Was that you, Al? It was a like a GPR bendy Jar Jar Binks that was attached.
Oh God, yeah, but was that for character?
It was for character. That was
Yeah,
the first,
it was that.
It was that.
Yeah, I remember those. That was a boss of mine.
98,
yeah.
99.
Well, if it was for character, it's 2001. But if it was pre that, then yeah, it must have been a Hasbro thing.
I don't think they would have produced Jar Jar products for episode 2. It would have just been episode 1.
Yeah,
it possibly was Hasbro then. Probably was.
Yeah.
Probably what happened at Hasbro was you would get an inventor item would come in and, we would develop, various things, usually licensed things being Hasbro. So it's very and quite possible that it was Hasbro, and it probably was an inventor item that had come in that we were trying to develop.
And then Camelot somewhat imploded, and I went freelance for a short while, and then I was picked up by an old Camelot colleague, Sean Miles, who by this stage was running the workshop at Design Works Windsor, and Design Works was looking to add sculpting to its capabilities, and they asked me if I'd like to do that, and I did. Thought it was a great opportunity. So that's really the start of Al and my relationship, going back to 2002 probably by then. Sliders were the first thing. Did Marvel, Mystique, Wolverine, with lots of comic based, sort of game toys. It's mostly that was then.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interject, but I was just thinking there. It was interesting because previously, certainly at Hasbro, when you commissioned sculpting, you kind of got the sculptor came in. You told them what you wanted. He went away. He brought it back. If you wanted something changed, he took it away. They brought it back. Quite often they were model makers as well as sculpting. And quite often with Hasbro, it was a mechanism or a gizmo as well as sculpting. But it was that kind of see it now, see it in a week, see it now, see it in a week, see it now, see it in a week kind of thing. When Ed and I first met, I think that was the first time when I actually started to dialogue properly with the guy who was doing the work. So we would sit down and literally talk about the nuances of things. And Ed would always say, do you like this? Or, and he was always quite receptive. And sometimes I would, looking back, I was probably quite negative sometimes, because I would probably go, oh, I'm not sure I like that. I don't get it. I don't see it. But I think it was that ability for us to actually communicate that was really useful.
It's always been a thing of mine in terms of getting the best product, especially when doing this weird bridge that you do between manufacturing and licensing, where you have to be giving consideration to the needs of both, and trying to communicate to licensing the issues and restrictions, because there's always manufacturing restrictions on things that maybe take things in a way that force you to make choices that in an ideal world you wouldn't make, but that's just the reality of dealing with that kind of thing. We sort of, at Camelot and through to Design Works, we developed a very strong sort of ethos of working with all parties to try and make things as good as we possibly could, and that led me to really good places in terms of dealing with Star Wars stuff because I used to go out to Skywalker Ranch and actually get actually
it's amazing. It's
get
brilliant.
things approved and they really loved this. We were the first people to do it, to go and actually take our sculpting tools and sit in the office and hand them the thing and them saying, I don't think you quite got the likeness, or could you put this bit of expression in on stuff, and we'd sit there and do it. And
Wow.
that I developed a similar relationship with BBC Worldwide. At the time, the children's division was run by an amazing woman, Maggie Evans, who she used to do all approvals for Doctor Who and Teletubbies, and they were based in this beautiful ancient old 60s office building, and they had these incredible dark wooden cabinets that were built into their walls that were just stuffed from floor to ceiling with the most amazing array of product samples. And I would just go, I had almost weekly appointment to go in there and talk about Teletubbies and
I think she was the person I got vague memories of Maggie, but I think she was the person I met that told me Doctor Who was coming back, because we ended up doing something on it. It wouldn't have been Doctor Who then, but I remember we got chatting about Doctor Who, and I sort of said, "Oh, I've just watched that Scream of the Shalka thing. It's pretty good, but not Doctor Who, is it?" And she sort of said, "Oh, well, be careful what you say, because it's a stepping stone, and there's something else coming." And that's all she said. And then, 2 years later or whenever it was, that's when they all got announced. So, yeah. I remember speaking to her, yeah. And those offices were sensational.
I think when we're now sort of getting to the point where the both of you have sort of started working together, and just maybe I'll briefly tell the story about how character and you got involved with Doctor Who, the range, and how quickly that came about.
Yeah, it was quick, and it was problematic. I think is probably the best way of sort of saying it. So what happened was essentially BBC Worldwide, Richard Hollis and somebody else, and I can't remember who somebody else was, but it might have actually been somebody from Bad Wolf Productions. And this ties in with the TARDIS story from earlier. So basically, Richard Hollis and somebody else came to the character office, and we were sitting in my boss's room, and they'd been and spoken to a lot of toy companies. And I think the front runners at that time would have been, who were the guys that did Thunderbirds, Ed?
Oh, Vivid Imaginations.
Vivid, yeah. So Vivid were really big. They had a lot of experience with figures and play sets and toys like that. The character, I would say, arguably didn't. And they were probably the front runners, I would think. But the BBC, being the BBC, were doing due diligence and basically going to other companies and having the discussions with them. And they got to us. And obviously, being a Doctor Who fan, I got sort of dragged into the conversation, and I was doing product development. And their sort of parting line was, "Okay, that's very nice. You've told us everything about character, what you do, and how fast you can do stuff. The important thing here is that whoever gets this is going to have to really like Doctor Who and be a real, essentially a Doctor Who nut's got to be involved in this." My boss kind of turned to me and went, "Tell them." And I went, "Okay." So
You've lost the leash.
yeah, literally, kind of was like point and click. So he just basically said, "Tell them," and I just sort of went off on one about Doctor Who and the fact that at that point I had a TARDIS at the bottom of my garden, and they kind of, you could almost see them sort of look at each other and kind of go, "Oh, I think we found the person.
We found our man."
We found our man," kind of thing. And then we didn't hear anything more about it until basically we then were told that we had the license. We had to pitch very quickly the products that we were going to do. So we had to concept something up, or at least put a list together of what those things were going to be. But the worst thing was we had no time. If you remember when Doctor Who came out, and one of the other things I think they got on board with us for is our speed to manufacture. And because most toy companies like Hasbro and various other ones, they usually work a year ahead. You know, we're working now for what's going to be released next spring, next summer. Because basically in the toy industry, there's two releases. There's a spring release, and then there's essentially the stuff you're working on for summer release. But we could pretty much at that point go from concept to finished product in something like 5 months, which was pretty damn fast by most toy company standards. So yeah, I think that's essentially why we got it. One was I was a bit of a Doctor Who nut, and just our speed to manufacture, and they kind of knew they were already behind by the time they started. And then we sort of got whizzed off down to Cardiff to meet various people involved in production. Ed Thomas specifically, he was sort of heading up the props and design department. But yeah, essentially we had to, we got to photograph various things. And at that point, it wasn't just design works. We were using, like Ed says, we were using a bunch of people. So things like the very first Sonic, I have a memory, rightly or wrongly, that I think, because I remember, no, it was Sean. It would have been Sean. So we went down to Cardiff and we photographed the TARDIS, and Sean took measurements and a whole lot of stuff. We had various meetings down in Cardiff where we sort of were presenting the sculpt. But that's essentially how it started. Yeah. Some things were extremely bizarre back then. Like they would give us sort of unfettered access to a lot of photography. The way it essentially works with the BBC, and still does, is they don't like you having a direct contact with production or the brand team as it is now. The brand team basically work with production. So they just don't like you having a direct contact, and they never have. Albeit it makes things a bloody sight easier. But from their point of view, I can understand it, because production's on a massively tight schedule. They were probably in series one having their own issues that they wanted to deal with. So you might get one of those, but essentially everything then goes through BBC Worldwide, or BBC Studios as it is now. But BBC Worldwide, as it was back then, was basically the commercial arm. So yeah, we deal with the commercial arm. The commercial arm says, what do you need? We say, we need this. They go to production, they organize it. So whether that's photography, assets, 3D files if they exist, blah, 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 blah. That's how it worked then, and that's exactly how it works now. But as I was saying, there was some slightly odd stuff, like the Dalek, which was the big thing for that year, the 12-inch Dalek. And we asked several times if we could come down.
I just happen to have one here.
Yeah, we asked several times if we could come down and measure the Dalek, and every single time we were told no. And that Dalek is massively compromised, as was our first 5-inch Dalek, because it's got that.
I personally think this is brilliant, and I was absolutely stoked when I got this.
Oh yeah, but it's it's obviously dimensionally it's got a fat bum, so we all know that.
Well,
but had production just said to us, basically the shape, the actual dimensions of the skirt are exactly based on a classic Dalek, we would have been fine. But we were using photographs which are not You know, it's not like CAD. You can't get
Yeah.
an actual side view.
Photographs walk. I mean,
So,
Yeah.
and even when we
So-
took the Dalek sculpts, and they were sculpts, they were these massively heavy resin things. And even when we took those down and placed them on the table, they would go, "Oh yeah, that's fine, that's good."
What was the very first item that you had to get ready?
So we had three. I say three. We had a bunch of things working in parallel. We had the 12-inch Dalek, which was going to be the big hero item that we were desperately trying to get out for Christmas 2005. We had a walkie-talkie set, which was the Slitheen and the 10th Doctor, the 9th Doctor, 10th Doctor, 9th Doctor. We had, I think, the TARDIS phone flasher, which was the little, literally this size, that sat on your desk with an LED on the top. And when your phone rang on silent mode, the light on the TARDIS flashed on and off to tell you that you were getting a call. Something you wouldn't even do nowadays. But your phone would probably just come up with a spinning TARDIS and whatever. We had the TARDIS money bank, which was the one where you put your money in the slot and it played the sound, and the sonic screwdriver. And that was essentially our opening gambit.
Here's one I prepared earlier.
Yeah.
The sonic screwdriver.
Yeah.
And the big upset for me was, I remember sitting, I think I've said it before again, but I remember sitting in Hong Kong, devastated in my room in the hotel, devastated by the fact that I had spent most of the day arguing with the engineers, trying to make the Sonic 1-to-1, and we just couldn't do it. There was literally no way. So the compromise was it had to be X amount bigger, which I think is roughly 10% from memory. And it didn't matter how we worked it because of the way the batteries were going to work, because of those button cells. And because that internal piece had to shuttle up and down inside, and it had to screw together, and it had to meet old toy safety regs, it had to be bigger. So, the Sonic sold extremely well. I mean, the original one we did was the one that had the UV ink on the end that you could, so everything couldn't just be a toy. It had to have some other function. So,
functionality.
Walkie-talkies, you put the Slitheen's arm up in the air, and that was the aerial, so you could talk into the Slitheen's groinal area and have a conversation. The phone flasher had to have a thing. The TARDIS doors on the money bank had to open to reveal a picture.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my Slitheen had a broken arm, so he's permanently fixed in those stents.
So they all did. We received a massive pallet of walkie-talkies, which is why that product was late. So basically, a massive pallet of walkie-talkies arrived in the mill. They checked the entire batch, and every single one had the arm broken off. And the reason was that the factory had, without telling us, just swapped in virgin plastic. They'd swapped in what's called regrind. So anything that isn't used first time around, what happens is it essentially goes in a bucket, but it's been through the injection molding machine. So it's been essentially hard plastic, and they grind it down back into essentially a dust, like a crumbly dust, and they put it back in with the master batch, but it's brittle because it's been through the cooking process once. So if you can do that and still get away with it, not with PVC parts, but with ABS, so basically they'd stuffed about 10% regrind into the injection molding machines, and it was so brittle that even the ones that hadn't arrived with the broken arms, you just literally had to raise the arm and it sheared off. So the whole lot got scrapped. And
some interesting challenges there, gents, I think. And I think that sort of covers off one of the interesting challenges that were faced with those early products, I think, as you described. And then we sort of go from, the walkie-talkies, remote control Daleks, and then almost we've got the action figure range, which is where our story sort of commences.
So what sort of time frame was there behind the scenes between that walkie-talkie stages and to when we then got the disco rose and the ninth. We're going to call them the disco because it's just everyone understands what we're referring to.
Everyone knows, yeah. So the honest answer was it was already. I'm trying to remember what the timeline was.
I looked it up last night.
Oh, you did? Go on.
Because I've got the first images that we have of decorated samples. So sculpts were in play up to April 2005, and we did all of the deco samples for the walkie-talkie, the RC Dalek, the 5-inch Dalek, and the Doctor and Rose disco in that month. Just going back, I do have a little story about the walkie-talkie, which was a nightmare from my perspective.
Yeah, far away.
Go on.
Which is almost a confession. I don't think Al's ever heard this or knew it, but we had to sculpt those figures in very short order. And at the time, the sculpting department at Design Works was myself as the head of the department, Andrew Teal, and Alex Down. There was just the three of us. And Alex sculpted the Slitheen, and Andy and I sculpted the Ninth Doctor. Andy did the head, and I did the body. And we had, normally when you look at a sizable detailed piece like that, you need a good, 3 weeks maybe to get it absolutely perfect. And I think we had about 2 weeks. So I came up with the fantastic idea of doing a little bit of a shortcut. And the shortcut that I did was, rather than take time to block out the anatomy of the figure, I used a articulated Spider-Man as the basis and sculpted over it. So I went out in Windsor. There's a fantastic department store called Daniel's, which has one of the most beautiful toy departments of any department store I've ever been in.
It really is.
And I got this 12-inch Spider-Man, and I sculpted over it, and we felt very pleased with ourselves because we sculpted the figure in half the time, and it still had nice detail. And I'd spent lots of time doing some texture on the leather jacket and all of the things that you'd want to do. Really happy about it. Al had seen it and liked it, so I threw it over to our casting manager to do the next stage. Always with these parts, once the sculpts, the raw sculpt's been approved, they used to, when we did everything physically, you have to silicon mold it, because you can't risk the sculpt leaving the building and then getting smashed to pieces in transit. As an investment in that object is high, as you'll imagine. So you make a silicon mold of it, and then you do resin castings. The thing that I had forgotten in my eagerness is that an action figure is hollow, and silicon casting occurs under vacuum. So we put this 12-inch figure in, and it promptly imploded. In the silicon, and then I had to wait 12 hours before the silicon had gone off to cut it out, and then I had to work on it. And I thought I was looking at having to resculpt the entire thing. As it turned out, all I needed to do was put it in the oven and get the plastic soft again, and then I poured resin inside, and the heat just made it expand back out to what it should have been. And in the end, all I had to do was fix a few cracks. But I was absolutely terrified of having to tell Al that I'd actually destroyed the model that he liked. But
yeah, no, well, we also, that was we had the sort of horror of, because that 12-inch decorated figure was the one that ended up being shown live to Chris Eccleston on the Jonathan Ross show, where I, luckily enough, one of us who took it down there, me, was able to be in the audience, and actually got to sort of meet him afterwards. But so we had that where we presented it, and that, of course, was the point where we also learned that he was leaving. So the next day, the whole of the toy industry was basically, ha ha ha, you guys have, just bought into something and you've invested in all this Doctor Who merch and the main actor's gone. Sucks to be you kind of thing.
Well, little did they know.
Well, little did they know. So it was sort of, we'd had that breakneck run to sort of try and get everything ready for the end of that year. There was a few trials to overcome for sure, but we sort of did it. Ironically, going back to the Dalek shape issue, one of the prototypes that Ed's guys put together was using a radio controlled Dalek by, what was the company?
Product Enterprise.
Product Enterprise, which were the brilliant classic Daleks. And the irony is, the model they put together
Was the right shape.
actually geometrically more correct than the one that we produced in the factory. So again, it's just back to that thing of, if you assets and access is brilliant, but if you don't get all the info, there's a knock-on effect.
They are a wonderful display piece, those products, but unfortunately we're quite frequent to as I used to be in the repair game once upon a time in a previous life, and have repaired quite a few 12-inch of those Daleks.
Yeah, the eye design,
connections and more internal circuitry used to play up.
Yeah,
The
fact that we changed factory, so we got some merch out for Christmas 2005, and then we almost immediately shut down production and literally moved the entire tools across to another factory. And then there was an eye change design that happened there. So if you're unlucky and you got a 2005 one, the factory was a nightmare. It's quite likely they're more problematic than the later ones.
I think mine's a 2005 one.
Yeah.
Oh well, don't switch it on, Shane.
I made my parents put that in their hand luggage and fly that back home. The big
He may exterminate you.
So just to reverse a little bit to the disco stances, my recollections of early 2000s, the main it figures was Episode 2 Star Wars. Hasbro had brought all those out, and they were all in those action poses, if you recall. Sometimes you'd have the squeeze ones and the arms would move when you move the legs and that sort of thing. Was that industry standard at the time to have the action pose, and that's sort of forced your decision?
No, this all came about. We weren't doing figures, we were doing Daleks, and the 12-inch Dalek was great. And my boss at the time, well, still my boss, but at the time he was, it was Daleks and TARDISes and Sonics more than anything else. And we had the 12-inch Dalek, and we wanted some radio control smaller Daleks that basically would you could use against each other, which in and of itself caused a problem, because we asked the BBC, can we change the color of one Dalek, because they're going to be fighting each other. And basically you radio controlled them around, and one Dalek fired at the other one. It flashed and it died. So if you hit the other Dalek 3 times, then basically it stopped working and you had to reset it. So it was a game. Essentially, it was a radio control head-to-head game. And the scale that we could make those Daleks to was by miniaturizing everything. And it had less features than, so the middle didn't turn, but it had to have certain things in it. That size, I think, was primarily, but not completely, set by basically a combination of Ed's guys working on it and our Far East guys sort of saying, here's your battery compartment. It's going to have 3 batteries, AAAs, and it's got to have, this stuff in it. So Ed's guys basically, by default, created the 5.5-inch Daleks, and that was it. That was the set. It was 2 Daleks that fought each other as a complete afterthought, as a value added. The suggestion was, we'll put 2 static figures in the box. So you'll have the Doctor and Rose in that pose with the 2 battle Daleks. No articulation, nothing.
Yes,
just
aware of that.
Figures. So
almost.
She has her name on her back, just in case she forgets.
Well, that was we wanted something on the back because she had Punky Fish, I think, was the brand that was on the back of her.
Ah, yes.
You got to pay the brand.
Now, what we didn't realize back then is that clothing actually per se does in the UK isn't copyrighted. So if Dolce & Gabbana create a jacket and somebody copies it, there's actually nothing wrong with that. You just can't pretend it's a Dolce & Gabbana jacket by the design. So in terms of the clothing and stuff, fine. But if it's got a brand name or a brand look, then you couldn't do it. So that's why she ends up with the rather lame Rose on the back.
So after that, we then moved on to into 2006, where, if I'm not mistaken, we started to then hit Series 1 figures. And then we've got
I don't know. Ed might have a few anecdotes about that Rose and Doctor figure before we move on to that, because he obviously worked on them. So I don't know what your memories are of that. I remember being slightly disappointed by the fact that they weren't going to do anything, Ed. But
well, yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? I think always with anything you produce, the big thing we always say a sculpt is only as good as the reference you have to produce it, and that's clear with the Dalek. But to a certain degree, it was the same with the characters, because it's no fault or disrespect to the BBC that they simply weren't geared up to producing the sort of reference materials that you need for doing really sort of accurate sculpting. They had the only materials we had is a very famous, photo shoot, because you think about all of the stuff that's produced from the Eccleston era uses the same imagery from that one photo shoot, because it was the only one they ever did, and the one that's got the TARDIS in as well. So even though it's such recent history, 20 years ago the internet wasn't full of a wealth of high resolution imagery like it is today of Christopher Eccleston and Billy Piper. So I remember creating the sculpting reference boards, the sort of the boards we used to work off the sculpts, and the different sources that we used to try and get those sculpts as accurate as we possibly could. But the photo shoot with Chris and Billy was in a white studio, which produced a lot of high contrast with his very dark costume. So it was really hard to see details of the actual, what his boots were, what his what his trousers were doing, and there's a lot of photoshopping and really, really messing with contrast and shadow to try and get those details and see what everything.
Yeah, it was a very simplified photo shoot. It was
the thing that's always amazed me is that the BBC went to court with Metropolitan Police to own the image rights to the police box, and they've never actually used a proper police box. To this day, they have various versions of a police box, but it's never that one that we were chatting about earlier. But that's the Mackenzie Trench Mark II British police box, probably more iconic from the.
So they've got the rights to that now, but they've never actually had a Dr. Travel in it. It's always some modified artistic version of a TARDIS.
Yeah. So it has changed, and that's their prerogative, everybody gets to put their stamp on it, which is, and it's
So-
hey, it's
so
done
that's-
us because we've done a ton of TARDISes, so I ain't complaining.
Oh yeah.
But I do have a love for, being a bit of a TARDIS maniac. I have a love for that TARDIS in particular. That
Yeah,
mod.
I used to not like the movie TARDISes, the Cushing film TARDISes, until I made a scale version of one, and I'm like, oh, yeah, this is good. I like this one.
Yeah.
I really
It's very-
like this. It's
It is, and that the Bernard Cribbins running across the square and
yeah,
is in the corner. It just looks right, and I guess the thing we forget, because we're even at my age, I grew up in Scotland and there was police boxes around, but it was common street furniture in the UK for such a long time, and even after they weren't using them, they almost every city or major, certainly in London, major metropolitan sort of region had police boxes. There's old, whenever there's an old film set in London, I always end up watching it. And 9 times out of 10, when they're going down the street or whatever, there's a
old box
background. They're just fabulous. Fabulous.
no,
things.
exactly. So as we move into 2006, you obviously made a creative decision at some point to push forward with figurines and to make them neutral posed. What sort of choices were made behind the scenes there to say, right, discos were what they were. We can take these and go a lot further with them.
So full credit goes to my boss for, at the time, for the figurines, because it was actually him that identified, we got the sculpts in, and I think, it was actually him that said, what, these look bloody good. And he's been in the toy industry forever, and his ability to spot product opportunities is just unparalleled. He's brilliant. And it was actually 100% him that just sort of looked at the static figures and kind of went, we should do action figures. And we said, yeah, shall we change them? And they was like, no, because they've got to go in this set. So that's why the first action figures ended up being the weirdly articulated versions of the statues, But yes, it was essentially the second coming. So it was for me, it was completely tied to that range of actor. The opportunity there was to basically have a regeneration set, which ironically still had the disco dancing doctor and now a disco dancing tenant. Essentially, it was the old classic character, just swap the heads, it's cheaper. So
save $1 where you can, or £1 where you can.
And then it's a strange mix of some odd Series 1 choices, and I'm sure Ed will tell you more, but we had some odd Series 1 choices. We had the mocks, and we had
the mock story I have heard before. I'd like you to recount that, because that kind of relates back into the amount of production images you had available on the characters, as far as you were given images and you were said, make what you wish to make.
So this is back to that sort of philosophy of, we'll let out what we want you to see, kind of thing. So, the ones we were given quite early on were, and obviously the ones that were transmitted were things like the Gelf Lady, the Mox, Space Pig. They're all up on screen there. So that, and then some of the early, I think we were, and obviously the Autons as well. So they were all really good stories. So I don't think there was any issue per se with the choices. We had, I think, Dr. Constantine with a swappable head.
Yep.
I've always said with action figures, it's you kind of, you're on a double-edged sword, and you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. if you're ahead of production, in other words, if production is happening at the same time as you're getting the information, you're shooting fish in a barrel, because you're having to take a choice on which characters to go for with no knowledge of what the end episode is going to be like. So zero, you don't know whether the Mox is on screen for 5 seconds or whatever. So, if you're behind production and it's already been TX'd, you know exactly what's resonated and what's worked, which is why when a character do some of the sort of online exclusives and stuff, we can kind of pick our shots. And even now with the B&M stuff, you can kind of pick your shots because, you know which stories and which doctors kind of resonate.
Ed, were there any issues or challenges faced more specifically with individual sculpting wise? Because I know you were a hand sculptor at that time. You hadn't branched into the computer. I mean, to me, you mentioned Milliput before. I've got a tube of Milliput here in my drawer next to me. To me, it's witchcraft. How you turn a little bit of clay that size into something that looks like the Mox, into something that looks like the Slovene, or you look at it and go, yeah, that's David Tennant. Could you talk us through the processes of how you actually produce a sculpting side of that?
Yeah, I think so the industry, it's strange because the history of Doctor Who action figures reflects very much the history of prototyping toys in this country, and the great revolution that's occurred in the last 20 years of moving everything over from physical patterns, which is what we always used to produce, to digital patterns. So the typical route now for the Doctor Who figures is everything is created digital this side, it's approved digitally, and then those digital files are sent over to the Far East and they physically output them, and they start by making a tooling master which they replicate, and then those models are often sent back for turning into deco samples, into the decoration masters, and that process always used to be that first stage of the process back in those days were entirely done within this country. So the physical pattern was made, and as I said, once you've made a physical pattern, because of the investment in that sculpt, you need to replicate it. So you do a silicon mold of it and then do resin samples, and we do what we call a 2+1, 2 decorated samples, 1 master, 2 decorated samples, because 1 decorated sample goes to the Far East, the other decorated sample stays back in the office with a character, so that when the first paint samples are sent back from the Far East, there is a point of comparison. You know that you've both started with the same object, but you would find often that through handling and stuff, paint colors might have changed in the factory, but you've got a point of comparison between what they send you and what you send them to check how the fidelity, check how they're done. In terms of the actual sculpting, it's a funny thing, because I do have and I have always had a slight sort of chip on my shoulder about the value that artists that work within the toy industry have in terms of general society. If I go out to London today, I can go to any number of galleries with sculptors who aren't, in terms of their ability to reproduce a likeness in
life, yep,
in a physical medium, any more or less talented than people I've worked with my entire career. And the fact of the matter is, there's like the established figure range that we had there, the success of those sculpts, is very largely down to two sculptors, Andrew Till and Alex Down, and then as we move more into out of 2006 and the early Doctor Who, we move into Tennant's era. We've got much more of a within the organization. I have many more sculptors, so many more people join in that conversation and contribute to the brilliance of the line. But Andrew Till particularly is just a staggering ability to create an incredible likeness in the smallest amount of material. So all figures were sculpted basically out of two materials in the main. Sculpey or Promat, which is a thermopolymer clay. So that's, people would be probably most familiar with the with FIMO as a readily available brand. It's like plasticine. You sculpt with it. When you're sculpting, you have to knead it to get it nice and plastic and elastic, and then you add with it, and you sculpt physically using tools. When you're happy with the sculpt, you can pop it in the oven at 180 degrees for 15 minutes, and it bakes off solid enough that you can then physically carve it and sand it if you need to. So you'd see on people's desks, if they were sculpting a few figures, that they would do the base sculpt. They'd start with a cocktail stick, and they'd bake off a bead of Sculpey, and then they build up. Most sculptors would work additively. So within sculpting, there's basically additive and reductive sculptors.
Yeah.
Your reductive sculptor has a block of marble and sees the statue of David inside it and carves.
Yeah, I was going to say the Michelangelo approach.
That's it. And then additive sculpting is what we would traditionally do with clay in large scale. You would add clay and sculpt it.
Approach.
And that's how we sculpt the likenesses in the Doctor Who range. So I personally, as a physical sculptor, I did on that early stuff. I did the revised Ninth Doctor, the non-disco dancing version, and but probably the first figure that I actually worked on. Because bear in mind, within the studio, I was directing stuff and taking meetings and all that kind of stuff, which doesn't really leave you a lot of time to do sculpting. So I used to fit it in where I could, and I would actually tend to only do sculpting in an emergency at that stage of things. It's sort of one of the reasons I work the way I work now, is because over the years I sort of got further and further away from what I love doing, which was creating things. And so I'm very pleased for the last 14 years I've been creating stuff for myself, and it's been a lot more of a happy experience. The Sycorax leader, and that was probably mostly sculpted actually out of Milliput, because I work at very small scale. I probably work better as a combination of additive and reductive, and I would have made that out of Milliput and carved into it rather than started with Sculpey. But all of those early likenesses,
details in that figurine, if that was your first foray into that Who sculpting, and that was an amazing detail in the Sycorax leader. So basically, to bring it back to that first slide, then I think in everybody's head these days, you think, oh, that's that file, that's just been shrunk down to that file, or why can't you take this file and bring it up to this file? this size. But back in those days, so the Ninth Doctor that came out on the disco stands and the Ninth Doctor as the walkie-talkie, so they were individually different sculpted pieces,
completely different
size.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays you'd say, oh, they've designed it at this, printed it at this, and printed it at that. Whereas, so there would be differences in the likeness of Christopher Eccleston, for example, in those products, depending on the sculptor, depending on what was noticed in his details you could do at 12-inch scale that you couldn't do at 5.5-inch scale.
Yeah, I mean, completely. I think there's a common misconception out there, and I see it on the boards all the time, that that people now assume you've got CAD, and that CAD is just a case of upscaling. So they kind of go, oh, well, they've got CAD of the 12th Doctor, you can just upscale that, and you've got your 5-inch figure. It's dead easy, and it is, but that's partly true, I should say.
In the 3D printing world, it's true. You just set your percentages.
Well, so what they forget is the articulation points and everything. The engineering, essentially, of the figures is completely different. What you have is essentially what we had in the old days, which is a sculpt that is in a straight pose. The bit that then happens is deciding on articulation points and the engineering of the tooling model to make the individual parts, which is the figure literally taken apart into its component pieces. Each of those is, so I've always said the same thing. It's a compromise. If we were doing a 12-inch figure, for example, the compromises would be even more complex because you've got much more articulation points, but you still have compromises to make. Do you give Leela elbow joints, knowing that there had to be a massively fat pin go through that elbow, so her lovely thin arms would be hugely compromised.
And some of the female figures are quite slender in the arms at that scale.
Yeah, now that's a little bit different. So I've had the conversation, and have had the conversation a couple of times where I've been sort of that same issue's come back, and so I said, "Oh, look, the elbow joint's too thin. We'll have to thicken up the arm." And every single time I have to kind of go pull a Black Series figure out and kind of go, "Well, they've done it.
They can do it."
So if they've done it,
they can do it. We can.
Yeah.
If they can do a Princess Leia this big next to a Chewbacca this big and be the same scale,
yeah. So sometimes you have to kind of show them that the factories want to make stuff easy for themselves. The engineers are kind of the facilitators between us and Ed and the factory. So it's all compromising. Where do you put the screws in a TARDIS? Where do you people to this day still moan about the fact that the non electronic version of the TARDIS still has the speaker grill. It does, and hopefully one day I'll get around to changing that. But that's the way it was made. It was made to be electronic.
I must say one thing with the TARDISes, having taken a few apart myself, that little spring and how you've got to have the spring tensioned at a certain angle to get it to lock so that it turns the.
We did that specifically to piss people off. No, I'm joking.
Thanks for that. Now, all right. So I wanted to talk about some of the items because,
sorry. By the way, did that answer your question on the scale thing? So you're right though. Back in the day, there was, and actually, I still have a bugbear to this day, and I think Ed will attest. But things like the Cybermen, I sort of remember specifically going in and saying, Cybermen are big bastards. I want them to look like the big bastards, and they want to be at least, if Tom Baker's 6 foot, then the Cyberman should be, 6'7". He's, and let's scale them all bigger. And then the sort of moon-based Cybermen, or not the moon-based, but the space Wheeling Space Cybermen were apparently the biggest. They were like, and the Mondasians, they were sort of like supposedly 7 foot tall. So I was like, mate, make them big, make them big. They all ended up the same height.
So I'll segue slightly and then come back to the Cybermen. So as you can tell from behind me, I've made a lot of custom figures. I think over the last 4 years, I'm somewhere in the vicinity of 600 custom figures, which is quite insane. I'd like a wing in character options, just to say to Shane Cook's wing, thank you, as to how much money has been poured into the character options company.
Yes.
I do find some
foundations are built on your.
What was that, sorry?
Our entire foundations are built on your contributions. Thank you.
Well, actually, the local vet is as well. I've spent
Thank
so
you for your
much
service,
money.
Shane.
Hey?
Thank you for your service, Shane.
Yeah,
thank you for your service. I did find I had a conversation with someone recently in regards to the Cybermen, particularly the new series A Nightmare in Silver Scale. And I found myself thinking, well, to me, those Cybermen are not super tall. But I ended up going to the detail of looking into IMDb to look at the actor who was within the costume, then look at the actor's height, then compare that actor's height to the Doctor actor's height to work out where they are in the 6-foot scale of everything. So when someone has a point of like the Cybermen were always tall, which is fine, but some of those Cybermen have got additives, like the 10th Planet ones have got the big flashlight on their head. So I find myself often frequently going back to see what the actors were in the suits to get an idea of their size.
I mean, I think that's true. There's on-set shots of the very famous shots of the ladies on set with the Mondasian Cybermen in the snow scene, sellotaping the head parts on because they were falling apart so easily. But those guys are huge. But I agree with you, things like the Nightmare. I think it's just because, if it's like stormtroopers, if you don't get average Joe who's 5'10",
you're a little short for stormtrooper.
Then, and also if you're going to have a framing with so there's a 7-foot Cyberman and a 6-foot actor, you on screen, that's it's going to be yes, Doctor. You gotta. Sorry, but classically they were imposing. But I think you're right. I think latterly it's all changed. So
yeah.
And also, imagine finding tall guys when you've got 10 Cybermen marching across, in the middle of the night, like in the Tennant stories. You need 10 guys who are roughly the same height.
How on earth do they fit into those costumes? Oh, anyway, side, brain fade there. Now, obviously, a couple more videos time we'll bring up the obvious question about the Nightmare in Silver Cyberman. 2014, I think you made the 3.75 scale.
Yes.
On behalf of all the character options collectors of figurines, will we see one in 5.5 inch scale? Ever? Don't shake your head, Ed. Don't shake your head.
Well, I'm very conscious. I'm very conscious that there's now a growing divide of where the Cybermen stop, and modern iterations haven't really
caught the zeitgeist, if you like,
up. I think, as I always plead, it's down to budget, as you know, and I think it's quite common knowledge. We have a strategy now going forward. B&M are essentially old figures repainted for the most part, but in essence, they don't make us as much money because it's a retail item. The direct-to-consumer approach is what a lot of people do, including HasLab and Mattel and various others. The reason that works is it generates more capital, which means that if you're making more capital of what you're making, then you can invest that back into new products. So this year especially, we have a strategy going forward of a certain number of figures, and it's still all up in the air. If it works and it all sells through and it's clean, then brilliant. There'll be more of them. if it doesn't work, whether that's me picking the wrong characters or, you know, a particular character doesn't resonate, etc., then it won't. You know, it's fairly simple in business that, you know, if something works and makes money, you keep going. If it doesn't work or if it stalls, then you don't. Having said that, you know, we've just we're in the middle of re-signing the Doctor Who license for another 3 years. So I have a relative amount of faith that the intention is there. It'll be more limited products. I'm not going to say how many a year, but like I say, we have a strategy. It's in place.
Yeah.
More will be revealed as we go, and I'm sure at some point, probably towards the end of this year, when that raft of new stuff has gone out, we'll be able to talk about that. Will we ever see one? Like I say, I'm conscious that of the new Cybermen, the Nightmare in Silver one is missing. I'm also conscious that the 13th Doctor's Cybermen are missing. I know Rob Alsop, who made those 13th Doctor costumes pretty well. He's a great guy. But he's actually got that information. It was a mix of CAD and physical parts, and he's even offered them to me. In fact, he said, if you come down to the studio, which I've yet to do, you can give us all those assets. But I'm kind of reticent to take assets off somebody without 100% knowing that we're going to use them, if that makes sense. As in having an asset just for having an asset's sake doesn't matter. The Nightmare in Silver Cyberman, yes, we have. It was done at 3 3/4 inch, but it is a digital asset, so it can be scaled up and it can be done, but it is a brand new complete figure. There ain't no reuse in that figure.
Yeah, no.
It is 100% new figure, and even on the stuff we're looking at, I'll say as much as I can on that. There are a couple of brand new figures in there. There are, Christ, the fucking Gallifrey base will just go in and melt down. The infinite monkey cage will basically be like, oh, they're doing this. They're doing
these two complete new bodies.
Did you hear that?
He said this. He said no. So yeah, brand new figures grounds up are massively expensive. We don't do them lightly. The benefit of the Cybermen is they are an army builder to a greater or lesser degree. You know, you make one, and they always sell. But
they make great 3-packs.
You get kicked in the teeth because if we do that Cyberman, we'll be forever hung out to dry by the fact that we never did the Wheel in Space Cyberman.
No. So the crux of this little part, you mentioned the finances of producing that, etc., etc. And I think this has been raised in the past. Was there ever or is there a potential to be able to crowdfund some figures? And if that's the case, if it's possibly on the cards, what sort of quantities will we, money-wise, would need to be ready to be able to produce such a figure?
I don't want to go into the specifics of that, if I'm honest. What I will say is it has been discussed internally. I think it's common knowledge. I've mentioned it in other blogs. I don't think we've looked at it, but the problem with crowdfunding is you have to tell people up front what they're going to get on anything. So if we said tomorrow we're going to make you a Bessie, crowdfund it, we've got to make the Bessie model. We've got to get it decorated. We've got to get it manufacturable, broken down into tooling model. We've got to spend time and manpower to develop packaging and work with the factory to get the costing. And then we come back to you guys and say, here it is. This is what you're going to get. But you've committed
resources already.
However many, let's
then you need 1,000, 2,000, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, for taking Bessie as an example, that's probably a because you'd have to put in a whole bunch of other accessories to make it tasty enough, and a roof that goes on and all the other stuff. So those conservatives say that's a 70,000 quid investment just put in front of people who may buy it, but also who may not. And we've seen it with Hasbro's. They invest a shitload of money, and it doesn't get funded. But that money's been spent. All that front end money's been spent.
No, fair statement.
I think,
and then if there's a cataclysmic shift in oil price and the factory, and you go back to the factory after you've got it funded, and the factory goes, actually, we don't want to do that, or your price has doubled because oil prices have gone through the roof.
No, fair point.
So
Okay.
the answer is yes, but if I would love to do it. I honestly would love to do it, but it would have to almost be done as a digital representation of the ones off the top of my head. I'd love to do a console room, but again, you're gonna get massively hung out to dry, because if you pick the wrong one that everyone doesn't want, then you're stuffed.
Yeah, I just know that'll be the questions that are thrown around.
I'd love to do a Whomobile, and I'd do a Whomobile over a Bessie any day of the week. But again, you get hung out to dry, because people will be like, oh, well, they're doing a Whomobile and I don't want that one, so I'll wait for the Bessie, which is undoubtedly the next thing they're going to do. But then the Whomobile doesn't fund, or it doesn't make enough money. Do you know what I mean? It becomes a bit of a kind of rolling, and we've seen so many companies
snowball down the hill of
area of paying. I think it's well known that Big Chief were a good example of that, where they were essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul, because they were taking the money that people were committing for the new figures to pay for the stuff that was already in the system. And it's a very dangerous path.
You only need one thing to go wrong, one set of production delays, one issue, and you've got yourself a massive problem.
I mean, we all want to see the line continue as long as it can. And I understand, from America explaining that there is a risk with that sort of a selling model. And
I think you also have to remember there is a lot less Doctor Who collectors than there is the likes of Star Wars.
Oh, of course.
A lot.
Times have changed.
I mean, I would love to say there's thousands. You go back 10 years and your average shipping quantity was something like 35,000 pieces, give or take, worldwide. And that basically was America, UK, and maybe a bit of other international, Australia, whatever.
We were there. Thank you. Australia.
Nowadays it's averaging 5,000 or 6,000. So that's the other thing that I think you just got to bear in mind, that Doctor Who product cake is massively subdivided now. It's not just action figures and this. There's every iteration of Doctor Who product out there from high end to low end. And if you're not a figure collector, it means nothing to you.
No, fair enough.
So there's a lot of factors feed into the crowdfunding thing. I would love to do it. I would, I've spoken about it internally a few times and said, look, let's just do one. Let's just pitch one. Let's do the Master, the Ainley Master. Let's do that, and let's sort of get everyone to sort of vote and see if they want to buy it and if we can sort of make money off it. But the realities are, if you kind of start doing the math, you just commitment up front versus will you sell it. But as I say, we've got a different strategy now. The Character Options direct to retail thing is offering a higher end, I believe, a higher end product to the discerning collector, and it is at a higher price because you're getting all the devil in the detail stuff that we couldn't get on mass production stuff. And that's been quite an interesting thing for the factories to cope with as well, because on one hand we're saying here's B&M and paint this, do this, and on the other hand we're saying that's not good enough, this needs extra, that needs more,
we're charging more for this, get it right.
Yeah, we're charging more for that. Send me pictures of the faces, because if David Tennant's got an eye around here, we've got 6,000 pieces of stock that we can't sell. So yeah.
I think that's interesting too. Like the B&M range has sort of kept the Who collectors going. I think with that, I know they're slightly made to a price point, I think, but they're still good to have those repaints, because people who collected for a long time or have only just started have missed out on some of those that have been re-released as repaints, which I think is really great.
Just to steer it back to the Series 1 discussion, I do find there are quite a few figures, or at least 2 or 3, from that first series range that I can quite easily adapt into other models. One of which I found was the Gelf zombie lady. Her dress, Victorian era, Dickens, wasn't it? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So with this here, I've been able to adapt that dress and that costume into what a lot of customizers notice as an easy Sarah Jane Smith variant from the Pyramids of Mars. This particularly, I've added in primeval Helen Cutter arms, I believe, to make that Sarah Jane. And I've reworked it to make a female clockwork droid, a Lady Painfort in the background, and then an ace from Ghostlight. So I found that to be quite an adaptable body. And another one I found is also...
Those are fabulous. I love those.
I'm sorry, I was rabbiting on there. I didn't wait for you guys to join in. Another one I found I could use a lot of was the Auton. The Auton you mentioned earlier makes a good one for Ben from the Second Doctor's era. Harry Sullivan is another good one from that. And I find even today I was working on making another Ryan figure just out of some spare parts I had kicking around. They're Rory arms. And I'm thinking, what can I use that's an entire shirt? Because Rory just had that front plate. So what's an entire shirt? Series 1 Auton. You take the jacket off. So I need to get the torso for that. So I do find the Series 1 Auton particularly, and Jabe as well. Jabe makes a good version, I'm going to say there, of Romana 1.
Lovely.
That's another great little addition to the lines.
Jabe was my favourite figure for a long time. Favourite sculpt. Sarah Robinson sculpted her. Beautiful.
She came out really well. She's great. She was a fabulous.
And I think in a future episode we're going to highlight some of Shane's wonderful custom works and just do some comparisons, even potentially with figures that he's made there where there were gaps. And it's interesting how the part usage, even like when the decision when you're creating new figures, and how can you the Axon body is multiple reuse, which is fantastic as well. And it's just about being smart with it, part usage, really, isn't it?
Yeah, some figures really lend themselves. I mean, and it's weirdly, it's quite often why I think some of the classic figures quite often lend themselves better sometimes to doing things like updating parts or swapping heads and creating a new character. It's probably about easy peasy. With the new series, obviously, a lot of the monsters and aliens and creatures are very specific, and you can't really do as much with them. But in the classic series, a lot of it was boiler suits and dresses and shirts and ties, and there is stuff that is, as Shane has identified, there's stuff that is easier to sort of adapt. And I would say it's fair to say that back in the day when we were trying with the B&M range to kind of to be a bit more creative, that was always part of the thing, was without changing everything, what could I make this character into? Without changing everything, what could I?
Well, I think the Axon Man could have a few more goes.
Oh, there's a few more for the Axon Man, for sure. The set of tooling that goes with that guy now is insane. I mean, he's had so many.
But I think it's good, gents, how the again, like, it's just very clever, and it's all economical as well. It's got to be viable to make. It's got to be to make to a market to a certain demographic of people who collect these things as well.
Your point was, spot on. I mean, I never. It probably sounds like I do, but I don't in any way slag off B&M, because they are, almost wholly responsible for nigh on a decade of just having Doctor Who figures in the shops. So there is no way on earth we'd be where we are now without B&M. The only thing I will do is, quite often the investment that we put in wasn't justified, and I was responsible for a lot of that. But I think if you were scrutinizing it, you would sort of say, well, in terms of investment and time and effort and all the other stuff that was put into the B&M range, at certain points we didn't really get that back. It made some very nice figures, but we didn't get that back. So that's the real strategy between kind of like, and also you have to realize why and how B&M use the Doctor Who figures. They are used almost as a tool to increase footfall in store at certain times, because people have to come in, and when they're in buying a Doctor Who figure, they might be buying something else, or they might be buying a pallet of Doctor Who figures just to piss everyone else off. So, but B&M were and still are very good. I have to say, B&M stuff for this year, and it's on. It was on my desk yesterday. Some of it's bloody amazing. I think there's going to be something there that's going to please pretty much everyone.
Are we talking 2025 B&M here, Al?
Yeah. Oh, it's done. It's done. Literally, the samples are on my desk.
Ooh, excitement stages coming up.
Everything is done.
Al's happy with the 2025 range.
That's the reason that Gallifrey Base is alive with extrapolation of what I left some very random clues, and as predicted, from that the guys.
You started a frenzy.
Oh, pretty much anything you say starts a frenzy.
Al just has to log on. He's a bit like Phil Morris. He logs on and says, "The weather's turning today." Boom! What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah, I know. There's some stuff like you say something quite innocently, and then But also they've clocked onto the fact that I 100% lie quite a lot of the time. So
never.
If I 100% deny something, then it's 100% happening.
I'd love to say something here, but I won't say something.
I made a rod from my own back there, and then then you're in a case where you kind of like, well,
My final reflection for this particular thing is that I don't think I could possibly have anticipated when we got those deco samples together of that first wave of product for character that we'd started the creation of the largest range of licensed action figures in British history. Obviously, there are licensed ranges which are larger and have gone on longer, Star Wars being the most notable. But it took Star Wars nearly 30 years to get to 200 figures, and we've been doing it for 20 years and got significantly more than that. So
just a couple.
I also think part of the success of the line is down to the detail. I know, I think Ed and I both said in the past, the neutral stance was kind of great for everybody because it was done to the articulation style that we were doing at the time. And if you had your time over again, we might change or do a few things differently. But the detail on those, figures that we put in blows anything else of the era, out the water. I mean, arguably the Black Series is stunningly good, but you have to remember when that came in, and that was long after Doctor Who had been going out. The scale, I think, was perfect, whether by hook or by crook or default or whatever. I think that size figure is great. It's not the tiny Hasbro size, but they have a bunch of detail and character to them that is extraordinary, and that's down to the talent of the sculptor. I think back to the days when I used to sit in the office with Ed, and he would hand something to me, and I would drop it and break it, and then he would put it back together and hand it to me again, and say, "I'll get that repaired. Don't worry."
So did you start bringing a small baseball bat to those meetings, Ed? Ready to flip him around the ears when he broke that next prototype?
No. You can't be like that. It's so often you're handing over something that has 5 minutes beforehand was in a spray booth. People are wafting a heat gun over to get the fumes of the primer are still high. So
I still to this day maintain that being subjective about the models was almost in a way far easier when they were sculpted, because the sculpting and the little ticks and changes and the asymmetry that was built in somehow, again, it's a double-edged sword. So on one hand, when you blew it up to send it to a licensor, that 15 mil tall head looked sometimes atrocious when you kind of blew it up, but in hand, at the scale it was intended to be, they looked fabulous. And with digital, I still to this day struggle to be quite so subjective. Still, even when Ed sends me turnarounds of stuff, I kind of look at it and I kind of go, "Oh, I can't see it from that view, and I can't see it from that side, and I can't kind of hold it in my hand and kind of."
Well, that's the standard sort of thing. Way that I present models, actually, weirdly enough, the way that I present models to any client stems out of the way that I present them to Al, which is I will always give the sculpt as a grey, or even I sometimes render in a wax like material, and do a decorated version, because the sort of the attachment to that original way of working, where everything that Al saw was a grey primered sculpt, a grey sculpt, effectively, and because you just that's just what you get used to seeing. So it's not surprising that you look for that as a thing. And I think Al's completely right. A lot of the issues that you have before digital sculpting, I think digital sculpting in a way is quite good for approvals, for the approval side of things, because in when we did things physically, then typically people were looking at a high resolution photograph of an object that's 15 mil, it's the standard likeness of a figure in the range is about 15 millimeters tall, and they've blown that up to the size of their 24-inch monitor, and it can't. No physical sculpt really can stand that, or there's very few that can. But then again, testament to the line that they the majority of them did stand up to that kind of
because a lot of these had to go out to the actors, as whether we liked photographs or imagery. I mean, the photographs were always brilliant anyway, but whether we were happy with it or not, that was what would go out to the talent to basically see for their final sign off, because they always got right of and like the first
Right
Tennant figure. Yeah, the first. I mean, we did the Barcelona David Tennant figure, which Ed and I absolutely loved, but has become a moment in time figure. But we basically had one of the first iterations we did was of the sort of really big smile that Tennant, Mr. Tennant, I should say, Mr. Tennant has after, and he's a lovely man. He's absolutely brilliant. But one of the first
he hasn't come down here yet.
Was just after he'd said Barcelona, and he had that sort of big grin on his face. And Ed and I loved it, but we couldn't get it past. It was a particular lady at the BBC back then who was absolutely lovely in some ways, but if she didn't have her head in the right place, she wouldn't put stuff through to talent to make that judgment call, as I think we all know. So certain figures, made it, and certain ones didn't, and that always pissed us off as well. And that's why, that gateway is great when it works. That gateway through BBC, and 99.9% of the time, that gateway works brilliantly. Occasionally, it doesn't, and when it didn't, it would fundamentally annoy. But there's that first wave of figures were brilliant. I've got very vivid memory of being in the factory and showing one of the guys on the line how the wash wipe effect on the Sycorax head needed to work. They kept bringing it to me, and I was like, no, and they kept bringing it again. I was like, I eventually walked over to the line. And
so as a final question with the Series 1 figures, I think we know Ed's answer, but what is your absolute favourite figure from the Series 1? I think you were going to say Jade, weren't you, Ed?
Yeah. I just when I saw that being sculpted, and I just remember just as you do, you want to, if you see something wandering in the wrong direction, you want to catch it early. It's nothing worse as a sculptor than working on something for 3 days and then have somebody notice something that they could have told you 2 days before. So I keep very strong contact, and I just loved watching her work on that sculptor, Sarah. She did a lot of the female likenesses. She just had a particular knack of always with sculptors. Funny, male sculptors have a tendency to make women look quite masculine, and they can't help it. It's just the way they, particularly in physical sculpts. So it's something in my own work I always really try to very, very hard to work against. But often the male sculptors then, when with the same struggle, will go too far the other way and will enhance natural assets that don't need enhancing. Sarah has.
What can we be talking about here?
Sarah was just so in tune with the way that the female sculpt should look, and she did, all of those Jabe and a lot of the female characters, but I just loved watching that take shape, and all of the details, and her working on the wood texture, and the dress, the artistry in the dress. People will know that I'm my head is in the range. I'm the Roman soldier in the Pyrovile set.
Yes, you are.
And that's why I got Sarah to do it, because I just loved what she was doing.
I was going to ask you that in a future episode. Did you sculpt yourself?
No, not for that range. I did for the HM Forces one, but yeah.
Al, have you got a particular favourite?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think Cassandra.
The skin one, or
It's brilliant. We didn't stop laughing for weeks. It was wonderful. Wonderful.
Yes, that's a story for another day.
That's a story for another day. Yeah, there's literally, the destroyed Cassandra goes down as the action figure of a corpse. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Why didn't we do it earlier?
I personally think that is just, hello, little fella. Whoever would have thought of a pig in a space?
Funnily enough,
Sloop John Field is so happy.
One, I think the head that was done for the regeneration David Tennant, I still think is a fabulous sculpt. And in terms of a full figure, and it's much maligned, but I actually think the Slovene is still
Yeah.
really good.
I'll agree with you, Al. I think I had a look at them again, just revisiting.
Very
That
nice.
Slovene figure is really well sculpted.
That Slovene was amazing because it was obviously a mix of practical and digital, and the digital sometimes kind of let it down, I think. And I think because of the nature of what they were, how they were represented with the farting and the belching and the gas compression thing, I think that made them a bit like the Santarans latterly, but that made them less effective as a monster. But the Slovene on its own, and especially that scene where I think it's Mickey in Rose's flat, when the Slovene is smashing through the door just before he kind of throws the vinegar over it. But there was something genuinely scary as about those things, and they are big bastards.
No, there was.
Yeah, they're up there with the
one figure I always wanted you to make, and it did show up last year, maybe as a prototype sale on eBay.
What was that?
That one.
Yeah, so I have Ed might be able to remind me on this, because I don't remember us ever making a Doctor in bathrobe figure. What I do remember was there was a chap, Tony, who basically I think wanted to sculpt Doctor Who figures, and I think the decision was by hook or by crook, because this is weird, because it's one of the figures that went to the BBC, I know, but it was never approved. But I think that was his test piece, if I'm right, to see if he was going to sculpt for the range. And just exactly as Ed and I predicted, it didn't get approved, not because of what it was, but just because the sculpt didn't quite hit. But that's gone out there into the ether, and somebody's got it now. It's out there, and it's turned up on eBay and a couple of other places. Yeah. But so the honest answer is it did come via us, and it did go into the BBC, but it was never on our hit list to make. And like I say, it was almost a default piece, so it was never an official character, as it were.
Well, I think I made my one out of Toby Z legs. I think that's a Rory shirt plate, a David Tennant jacket, a little bit of Milliput to make your, we call them mandarins, but you call them satsumas.
Love a satsuma.
And then that lovely first Doctor head you made for the regeneration. So
yeah, good effort.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're on about 26 unproduced figures now.
There's a challenge to get those knocked down and get them produced, isn't there, gents?
Never going to happen. The time has passed.
Yeah, that's true. There's always people that, we get asked a ton of times whether we'll do ever a figure of this person or that person. But there is moment in time. I always say there's moment in time figures and there's moment in time stuff that we did, which in hindsight, the fact that we didn't do it was, it's a bit like the Ralph McQuarrie sketches that weren't ever used, but then subsequently, Star Trek decided to use them 4 years later, or Lucasfilm decided to, and he did a ton of sketches, but the reason they weren't selected is because they weren't very good, and they didn't
Actually, wasn't there some big ant, some spider with a big head on it or something that appeared in Mandalorian 50 years after he drew it?
And it's nice, but it's nice to do an occasional homage like that. But there's a reason things don't get done, and just going back and reusing them for the fact of they're there. We've got a few of that. We had a few of those in character.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, that's been absolutely rubbish. I hope I never have to take part in this nonsense again.
See you next Saturday for Series 2.
Well, wouldn't you like to know the next thing we might chat about is potentially Series 2 and 3 figures and some of the fun times had with those. As I said, it's a bit of a nostalgia fest to go back and have a look at some of the wonderful things designed by character, not just the figures. We'll have a look at some of the other things developed at the time as well. And
one thing I was going to say, by the way, is if we ever get the chance of doing a 5-way, there's a chap called Dave Turbot who Ed and I worked with on a lot of the early Doctor Who's. I think he took over when Matt Smith essentially was coming in, Tennant was going out, and he actually joined us recently on one of the sort of podcasts I do with Kenny Smith. He's actually very interesting to have around because he remembers a lot of stuff from obviously the BBC. He's ex-BBC now, but he was reminding me the other day because I'd said, "Oh, we didn't scan Matt and we didn't scan Karen until this point later on in the day," and he was like, "Yeah, we did scan them." And I'm like,
"Well, you know what, Al, there may have to be
his knowledge of he would be great one." Joking aside, David, one, he's Scottish, so he can't do any wrong in my eyes. But he can't do anything wrong with that, laddie. No, he's actually really good, and his memories are also very strong because obviously he's a massive Doctor Who fan as well. So from his point of view, he got to work on just like the rest of us got to.
Well, we can talk offline and maybe get our fifth Musketeer involved at some point.
I'll put you guys in touch because he is good, and as I say, you've then got all three legs of the stool, as it were. You've got Ed on sculpting, you got me on the sort of product development middle manager sort of organizer side of it.
Don't undersell yourself.
And then you've got Dave, who was
the master of plastique, I think, as Kenny Smith called you at some point.
But you know what I mean? You would then have literally three people who could kind of, where one's information drops out, somebody else picks it up. So I think he'd be an interesting addition to the mix. Well, thank you very much for having us.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, Ed and Al. Always happy to chat to you, and I'm glad that you're able to impart some wisdom on us, especially us as Aussie fans that have enjoyed collecting these things from afar, and just putting our perspective on things. So stay tuned for some more interesting stuff. So thanks, guys, for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.